Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for making the trip over to Lipton Hall this morning. I'm Sam Chandon, the Silverstein Chair of the Schack Institute at the New York University School of Professional Studies. And again, welcome to our first Urban Lab event of 2018. As you know from the program, this event continues our overall thematic focus this year on how our most successful cities, whether in Canada or the United States or other parts of the world, manage the challenges of the success that they are experiencing, how it is that they can invest in the choices that they make that ultimately ensure that their long-term prosperity is guaranteed by addressing threats to affordability and access and inclusivity. Today's event is co-hosted with the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, and our thanks to the leadership of the Institute that has joined us here today in New York City, as well as the team from Premier Wynne's office that is also here. We're very, very lucky to have as our guest this morning Premier Kathleen Wynne, the 25th Premier of Ontario. Since taking office in 2013, Premier Wynne has helped transform Ontario into a fairer, more dynamic place to live and work for all Canadians. In recent years, she has pioneered historic changes to Ontario's healthcare and education systems, revitalized the province's infrastructure, and balanced its budget for the first time in a decade. Her legacy includes a universal basic income pilot program, an increase in the minimum wage, and expanded access to public education and medicine. We are honored to have the Premier with us today to brainstorm solutions for more equitable cities, particularly in those most successful like Toronto and New York. Premier Wynne will be joined by Richard Florida, renowned urbanist and author. Richard is Distinguished Fellow at the Urban Lab and Clinical Professor at the NYU SPS Schack Institute of Real Estate. He is also the University Professor and Director of Cities at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto. Finally, Richard serves as the editor-at-large of City Lab and an editor at The Atlantic. His latest book, The New Urban Crisis, was released in April by Basic Books, and we were delighted here at the Urban Lab and the Schack Institute to be one of the host sites for Richard's book launch in New York City. I'll now hand the conversation over to Richard, who'll be leading today's discussion.
Well, let's get started. The Premier is in the States. She's been having meetings in Washington, D.C., and really trying to think about globalization and trade and NAFTA and this uncertain environment. So why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit about how you're viewing our time in this uncertainty and how your trip's been going, the issues you've been confronting.
Thank you, Richard. I'm here with my Minister of Economic Development and Growth, Stephen Del Duca, and thank you all for joining us here this morning. It's a pleasure to have been invited. So Richard, you're right. I'm here in the States. I was in Washington yesterday and New York today, really talking with folks about our relationship, the Canadian-American relationship, and talking about that relationship in the context of uncertainty, in the context of a protectionist wave that is making its way across not just North America, but other parts of the world as well. And given that Canada is a trading nation, and given that our partnership with the United States and Mexico has been a pretty mutually beneficial one for nearly 25 years, we are concerned that dramatic changes to NAFTA, the wrong changes to NAFTA, we're not against modernizing. We think that a trade agreement that was in place more than 20 years ago needs to be updated, but we also believe that blowing it up or really dismantling what is working would be a real challenge. So I can talk more about that. I've been talking to governors for months now. I've talked to about 33 governors across the country. And on top of NAFTA, and I'm in New York, so I think I should address this. There are the tax changes and there's Buy America. There are Buy America provisions that one that has been put in place in New York already. There are other states like Texas that are looking at those. And as you will know, some of you, we have in Ontario, we have said, and we are going to be introducing legislation into our House when the legislature sits again in a couple of weeks, that would enable us to put in place mechanisms that would provide for a proportional response to Buy America clauses. I think it's fair to say that businesses and workers in Ontario expect us to take a stand and to respond, not to over-respond or overreact, but to respond when there is a threat to their ability to do business and to grow and to export. So we're looking at that. The provision that's in place in New York is strictly about procurement and government procurement, and so our response would be proportional. But I think just to wrap up that piece, we have to be aware that the partnership between Canada, the United States, and Ontario being the largest province, those are very, very important partnerships. There are 9 million jobs in the United States that are dependent on trade with Canada. There are 28 states for whom Ontario alone is their #1 or #2 trading market. 20, Ontario is their #1 exporting market. So that's a pretty strong statement about an integrated economy, and so I think we need to be very careful as we go forward. You and I are going to talk about uncertainty and how we tackle that, but I just wanted to put it in context that we're not just dealing with local uncertainty, we're dealing with global uncertainty.
Well, these states, New York and Ontario have long been kind of knit together at the hip, and I think about just today, I moved. I'm an American, adopted Canadian. Sam is a Canadian who lives in New York. Mary Rowe from your team was here at the Municipal Art League for so long. I guess the question, and we'll come back to Sidewalk Labs, here's a big New York company deciding it wants to open up on the Toronto waterfront. What could we do to fix this? And I guess I don't want to pick on Governor Cuomo, but he's a progressive governor with ambitions to run for president. You're a progressive premier. Is there anything we could do to fix this and bring these two places together? Or do you think it's just a runaway train with this uncertainty in Trump and the populist moment that we're going through?
Well, I don't actually. I believe that there are elected leaders and there are businesses who are really finding their voice right now on this subject. I would say in November or September, I would have been more anxious about our ability on this particular issue, on the NAFTA issue, to be able to have an impact. But I really do believe that businesses are stepping up, and I'm hopeful that businesses and elected leaders in the states, speaking to folks in the White House, that there will be an impression that's left, and that there'll be a realization that there's a lot at risk here, and that that uncertainty that we talked about, I think that sometimes what happens, or what has happened in the last couple of years, and we can look at Brexit, we can look at other parts of the world, trade and those international relationships have and are being blamed for some things that they may or may not be responsible for. So if we look at manufacturing, and Ontario is a manufacturing province, we look at the change in work, loss of jobs, change in jobs. So how much of that is because of trade, and how much of that is because of technology? How much of that is because of automation? Well, I think what we'll find is that probably more of it is because of advanced manufacturing and changes in business practice to increase productivity than it is about trade. So we have to be careful that we solve the right problem, and I think that right now with this NAFTA discussion, we're actually in the midst of a debate that really is about solving the wrong problem, or not identifying the problem correctly and then coming up, therefore, with a solution that actually isn't going to resolve it.
So one of the things we've seen in the news in Canada, hasn't been reported so much here. As an American, look, I never thought I would see this, but it's happening. Are American residents streaming over, it's not a wall with Mexico, with American residents streaming over to Canada in some numbers, I mean, they're showing pictures of them, to find a safe harbor. And I just wonder, as Premier of Ontario, what do you make of something like that?
Well, I think it's sad. I think that in the first instance, it's a sad reality. Canada has always been an open and welcoming place, and we know that our future sustainability is dependent on people continuing to come to our shores. I always comment when I'm in large groups of people in Ontario that, apart from Indigenous people, we all came from somewhere else. You know, to suggest that somehow we should now close the door because the next wave of people shouldn't be welcome is really counterproductive and antithetical, actually, to who we are. So I think that it is something that we have benefited from, and we are going to continue to find ways to accept people as they come. But the pain of it is that the United States has been the same kind of country historically. And so what is it that has shifted that has meant that people feel that they're not welcome? That's the part that I think is distressing.
I think we're going to get to that in a minute. Just one more question along these lines, because it shows the connectivity between New York and Toronto, New York State and Ontario. You know, Google Sidewalk Labs, by the way, was going to do a search, was going to do an auction like Amazon is doing, but a number of people, who will remain nameless, talked to them and said that would be silly. You should figure out where you want to go, and you should pick that place. And by the way, those nameless people, Toronto wasn't on that list. It was Detroit, and it was Denver. But somehow, through hook or by crook, this big new city building company, the Sidewalk Labs of Google, which is trying to invent the city of the future, picked Toronto as its location. Why do you think that happened, or what insight can you give? And also maybe, not just on the positive, and I'm a big fan of Google Sidewalk Labs, it's created some interesting conversations in Toronto and Ontario about the use of a public good called a waterfront, and how Google and the Sidewalk Labs might be a better partner. So just because we're here, how do you approach that issue?
Well, what I know about that decision, and I was not part of the intimate circle that was making that decision, but I know that our educated workforce, our particular combination of support for innovation, you know, it's the Toronto waterfront, but Kitchener-Waterloo, Ottawa feed into that ecosystem of talented, educated people who are available to that workforce, but also our diversity. I know that the diversity of Toronto and the region and Ontario was part of that decision making, and so it actually speaks to the last question, that, you know, the places that are vibrant and that are thriving are places of diversity, because that's where the best minds are gathering.
And to our knowledge, they didn't ask the province for any incentives, right? They didn't ask for any tax breaks.
No.
I was involved in the Amazon discussion. By the way, I've recused myself from the board of Toronto Global because I've taken an activist role. I don't think we gave much incentives in that bid package either.
No, in fact, we intentionally, and Ed Clark made it clear that we were not putting money on the table. The attributes of Toronto were what they were, and of Ontario, and so we sold ourselves on again, the educated workforce, the investments that we were going to be making in STEM going forward, and that's where we landed.
We also made that bid public.
We did.
Which is very important for those of you concerned with economic development, that in the United States, many of these bids have been private and are being kept private even in the wake of journalistic and citizen inquiry. So the idea of doing economic development in an open and transparent way. Now I want to shift gears. Go ahead.
Let me just speak to that for 1 second.
Sorry,
let me just say that one of the things about that bid that was important for us was that we were and want to do these things anyway. And so it was a gathering together of the initiatives and the attributes of our province, of our cities, to say, this is who we are, and whether we get the Amazon business or not, we are going to do these things. We're going to make those investments in our talent and our skills.
And I think it speaks to where we want, as Sam introduced, we're very concerned here at this is the biggest real estate school in the world. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to be connected to Sam, because I wanted to bring this knowledge of real estate. And interestingly enough, there is so many connections between Ontario and Toronto real estate and New York real estate. In fact, a group of Shack students are coming to visit in Toronto soon. But really, we're approaching these challenges of the major superstar cities. The cities like New York and Toronto and Los Angeles and San Francisco that are becoming so darn expensive. And I was just talking to a fellow from San Francisco. He was saying it's almost like a civil war now, with the citizens so irate about the tech companies. I think that's partly happened in the United States, because most places we don't have state governments involved in building a safety net. And our federal government in the United States said, the heck with you. we're going to do something else. But what you've done in Ontario, it's very interesting over the course of your leadership. You focused on competitiveness, you focused on innovation, you focused on growth. Toronto and the province are now more innovative places than they ever were. But in recent months particularly, you've always had this because it comes from, but in recent months particularly, more than any other leader, I'm being honest with you, more than any other leader, any other governor, any other national leader, you have really honed, you don't even call it an agenda for inclusive prosperity, you call it doing the right thing. But you've honed...
Fairness and opportunity.
Fairness, but you've honed an agenda for people in the United States and North America that is really about allowing more people to participate. And that's what I want to talk to you about. And let's start maybe with the first thing you did, and on healthcare. You know, we have publicly supported healthcare, and it's fantastic, by the way. I pay 25 grand a year for my healthcare in the United States. In Ontario, it's free, and it's spectacular. But you even wanted to expand that. So tell us a little bit about on healthcare, how that was an issue that you wanted to expand and give people even more access and benefit.
So let me just begin with what you said at the beginning, which is that inclusion. So I think that when we talk about the economy, which is really the environment we live in, we need that economy to be inclusive. And often when we talk about economy, we talk about the numbers and we talk about the balance sheets. We talk about GDP. But the economy is how we experience our lives. And so if we believe that having an inclusive economy actually makes for a stronger society, then we need to figure out how to support people so that they can take part in that economy. And what we're seeing, again, part of that uncertainty that we're dealing with, and the change that's happened is that even though there's more wealth creation, even though our corporate profits are up, even though our unemployment is down, even though Ontario is leading GDP growth in the country, not everybody's sharing in that wealth. And so we need to look for ways to make sure that people can take part and are supported. You know, I've been in office since 2013, but my predecessor came into office in 2003. We've been making investments steadily over that period of time in infrastructure, in education, in healthcare, and we've been building up, supporting business and fostering innovation. And there's more that we can do, of course, but that has been the agenda. But since I've been in office, we really have taken to heart and looked for ways, as we balanced our budget and got that in place, looked for ways to support people so that they could take part. So what you're talking about is the expansion of access to medication. When publicly funded healthcare was established in Ontario, in Canada, in the late 60s and early 70s, pharmacare was not part of it. So people who are living in pretty deep poverty have access to free medication and have had for some time, and seniors have, on a more modified basis, they pay a small deductible of about $100 a year and a bit of a copay. They have access to medication, but the majority of the population, unless they have a plan from their work, don't have access to free medication. So what we knew was that there were lots and lots of families who were going to the doctor, getting a prescription for their child's puffer for asthma or, you know, diabetic medicine, and not being able to fulfill the prescription. And so that's not a good thing. That means that that leads to more illness. So we have taken a step towards pharmacare, and that is that kids from their birth till their 25th birthday now have access to free medication, free prescription medication, to all the medication that's on the formulary. So that's a big step towards a universal pharmacare plan. We're not there yet, but that's the step we've taken.
By the way, having bought prescriptions in both countries, I can tell you, and I've done a little anecdotal study with friends who are binational, there's about a 10x difference in just the cost. A prescription that you would get in Canada is 10 times cheaper, or in the US is 10 times more expensive, just to start with. You mentioned infrastructure. Now, maybe we'll jump around a little, and that's a good thing. But folks may not realize Ontario is an enormous province. It stretches from probably New York all the way to Thunder Bay, or Minnesota, above Duluth. And what you mentioned infrastructure, and that struck me that there are successful parts of Ontario, economically thriving, Toronto, going like gangbusters, Kitchener, Waterloo, a tech hub, Ottawa, like our Washington, D.C., a knowledge hub, and others. But there are other parts of our province, your province, that are really struggling. Windsor, which was hard, like Detroit. And so one, I wanted to talk a little bit about, as a premier, how you balance this, what we call geographic inequality. And two, does infrastructure, and your commitment to transit and also high-speed rail in the long run, can infrastructure be a way, or are there other mechanisms that could be a way to help us cope with geographic inequality?
I think it's a really important part of dealing with that inequality. And just to the size of the province, there is not a policy file in Ontario that you don't eventually bump up against geography. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about health, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about education, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about social services, you're going to bump up against the delivery of those services over this vast geography. So we've got 444 municipalities in Ontario, and the vast majority of them are, in the south. And we're contending with urbanization, just like other jurisdictions are. So we've got a lot of rural and small town communities, northern communities that have depended on the forestry industry or mining industry. We have 134 First Nations who are, many of them on remote reserves. And so infrastructure is definitely a part of what we have worked to put in place. So by that I mean roads and bridges. We're looking now at broadband. How do we invest in broadband in a substantial way that would actually mean that there'd be connectivity across the province? And what that's done, Richard, is it's created jobs in the short term, which is what infrastructure building does. But it's also given municipalities the opportunity to think about what their economic drivers really could be if they had particular pieces of infrastructure. We've asked every municipality to put in place an asset management plan so that they know what their priorities are. And then we have put in place revenue streams. So, for example, there is gas tax. There's about 14 cents of tax on every liter of gas in Ontario, and we've taken 2 of those cents, which means it's about $300 million across the province, and we're allocating that to municipalities that have transit, and we're allocating it by population and by ridership. We're going to increase that by 2022 to double it to $600 million across the province, and that means that those municipalities have a reliable source of revenue to plan and build their transit systems. Now, most of those 99 municipalities are in small urban or urban centers, but we've also put in place infrastructure funds for the north and for rural communities because they need reliable funds as well. So on your infrastructure question, I think the biggest challenge is making sure that there's a reliable source of money to build, and we've tried to support municipalities in that.
One of the places the province touches the United States the most is Windsor and Detroit. And I'm thinking about, I think it's true, and you'll confirm this, that the province paid for the new bridge. But moreover...
Actually, that was the federal government. We paid for the road up to the bridge. The federal government came in to pay for the bridge. Now we just need the Americans to pay for the plaza on the other side.
But what I find
just a piece of it.
The most interesting Amazon bid, which didn't get selected, that I thought, even more so than Toronto's, was the Detroit-Windsor combo. Mm-hmm. My wife's family's from Detroit. We visit all the time. The idea that Detroit and Windsor could come together with that asset base, if there was some issues with immigration in the United States, you could put an R&D hub in Windsor. The fact that so much trade in the auto, just for a minute before we get back to inclusivity. This idea of Detroit and Windsor as a region seems to me quite a jewel, almost, that you could have a big American region with a big airport connected to a Canadian place with manufacturing, but also with innovation. How do you, it's something you've probably thought about more than I have, how do you see this Windsor-Detroit relationship?
Well, I think it's a really interesting microcosm of the relationship between Canada and the United States. Governor Snyder and I have spent a lot of time together. We've signed a memorandum of understanding in the auto sector in terms of innovation and how we can work together on AI. So we see, both he and I see this as a pretty important partnership. You know, when people talk about an automobile going across the border 7 to 9 times before it's completed, you really think about Detroit and Windsor. We're also doing an environmental assessment to build high-speed rail from Toronto to Windsor. And you know, it would be great to think about how we go across the border. So that's a 10-year plan.
I could visit my in-laws a lot faster.
There you go.
I want to, you know, one thing that you've done that I think would be of interest to all thinking Americans. We've talked a lot in this country about ways to support people who are economically struggling. And we've batted around a lot of ideas. But an idea that's gotten support on both sides of the aisle among eminent economists is the idea of a guaranteed basic income, a universal basic income. There's been a lot of talk in the United States and very little action. But you put in place a pilot program where you're delivering. So I think it's worth telling the audience a little bit about the universal basic income pilot, how it's designed, what you see it as achieving, and how it might grow or scale in the future. So
we've been talking about this in Ontario probably for 35 years. There are a couple of academic voices that have been very, very bullish on this and always thought it was a good idea. There has been a pilot in Canada in the 70s in Manitoba, but we never really took the learnings from that and extrapolated them to any policy. So there were a couple of things that were happening. This inequality that I've been talking about was one of the factors. The reality that our social assistance system has evolved into, in many cases, a trap, in many cases a punitive trap for people that doesn't allow them to actually get into the workforce or get into education, stay in education, doesn't lead to good health outcomes, leads to intergenerational poverty. That was a problem that I thought needed to be tackled in a real way. And then the third component is that as the world changes, we were just talking about automation, and we were talking about dislocation of people. I think we have real questions to answer about what work's going to look like and how we're going to manage in a world where a lot of the entry-level or more manual labor disappears. How are we going to deal with that? Now, I will say to you, I'm older than everybody in this room, I'm sure. I'm 64 years old, and I can tell you that in the 70s, we talked about this. We talked about what the work week was going to be, and what were people. You remember? I mean, what were people going to do with all this time on their hands? Now, that hasn't happened, but I think we're at another juncture where we have to be serious about what the nature of work is going to be. I wish we'd been talking about it and had some plans in place, but we don't. So, no time like the present. There are 3 communities, and there will be a First Nations community where up to 4,000 people will be, they'll be given up to about $17,000 per person a year, and that money will come without the strings that are usually attached to social assistance. And what I'm looking for, Richard, is, will there be better education outcomes? Will it mean that kids in families where there's a guaranteed income, will that mean that kids will stay in school? Will it mean that parents will go back to school and there'll be better retention? Will it mean that once someone gets a job, they actually are able to stay in that job until they're stable, and then they can grow from there? Will there be better health outcomes? Because those are the things that are a challenge for people who are living in poverty. And is there a way to tackle those through people having more like a living wage?
So you mentioned a couple times now the changes in work, and they're huge. I mean, you think about the world that we grew up in. I'm just a few years younger than you. I'm 60. And you think about the stable jobs. My dad in the manufacturing plant, those folks in Windsor, manufacturing in the great heartland cities of New York or the Ontario, the Midwest. That's gone. And there are the fortunate third of us, like all of us in this room, who get to do knowledge jobs, and 2/3 of us, a shrinking group in manufacturing, although Ontario does still have a big manufacturing base.
Well, in Windsor, interestingly, Windsor has the lowest unemployment rate in the province. So it's very interesting what has happened in the auto sector particularly, but that's another subject.
Yeah, and almost half people doing this, women, a lot of women,
Yeah.
a lot of new Canadians, a lot of people, members of visible minorities, new immigrants, doing this work in the service industry. So you've addressed this. We've talked about this. You know a lot about it, a lot more than many economists, about what we have to do to make sure these caring professions get rewarded. Women in the workforce, the gap, gender gap. But just elevating the minimum wage is something you've taken on. So why don't you talk a little bit more about how in this new world of work, and in the future world of work, the other things in addition to the universal basic income that you're doing, minimum wage plus, to try to help workers have a better deal in this uncertain economy?
Well, I think there's a fundamental challenge that we face as North American society, I will say, and that is that we've had a hierarchy of work, so that we have overvalued, I will say, some work, and we've absolutely desperately undervalued other work. And I've lived in Western Europe. I've lived in the Netherlands for 3 years. I had my first 2 kids there. I accessed services there. I lived there. And I saw a flatter society, where there was more value accrued to manual labor, work that we all depend on for a civilized society, that we just haven't figured out here, in my opinion. And so that's me talking. That's my philosophical bent. My mother used to say, "What do you think it would be like if nobody picked up the garbage?" How would that work? Because we talk about the discrepancies. So that's where I'm coming from philosophically. But what we know, Richard, is that over the last decade, 15 years, we've seen some work, and the payment for that work just off the charts. We've seen people increasing their wealth enormously. And then there's this band of people, as you say, many women who just have been flatlined. And so for whatever reason, there has not been on the part of corporations, I guess because there hasn't been the necessity, they haven't been pushed to it, they have not chosen to increase wages. That's not true in the public sector to the same extent in the public sector, but even in the public sector, we made a move 3 years ago to put more money into the hands of personal support workers, who are the people who look after the elderly and the disabled, in the hands of developmental support workers, so developmentally delayed people, the supports for those folks, and early childhood educators, people who work with children. Again, mostly women doing work that has been historically undervalued. So we put a specific increase into those public sector workers' wages. But generally, that wasn't happening. So we moved to increase the minimum wage to $14 an hour as of this past January 1st, and it will go to $15 an hour as of January 1st, 2019. Now, there are people who have, many people who have said to us, you're moving too fast, that it's too far too fast. The reality is that there was a period of time in Ontario during the government previous to us where there were 9 years where the minimum wage wasn't increased at all. So there was a hiatus, and in fact, if we had continued to increase the minimum wage, if we really looked at what a living wage is in Toronto, it's probably closer to $16 or $17 an hour. So my response to those voices is, you know what, the economy's doing really well. Now is actually the time that we should be increasing people's wage, because if we wait until there's a downturn, which is inevitable, then everyone will say, oh, well, you can't do it now because the economy's turned down. So we're doing that. And I can't tell you, Richard, how many places I go into, whether it's, I can say Tim Hortons. How many people in here know what Tim Hortons is? A coffee shop.
That's
yes.
one thing they know. They might not know that Drake or The Weeknd are Canadian, but they know Tim Hortons.
So I go into a Tim Hortons coffee shop, or if I'm in a hotel and the servers, the response I get, because they know that it's our government that has been responsible for them getting an increase. And it means the world. It means that they are able to look after themselves and their families as opposed to having to go to a food bank. It's that stark a difference. So I think it's among the most important things that we have done, and we'll continue to look for ways to support people.
Now, we're in the Real Estate Institute here, so we want to get down to housing and real estate. Ontario's boomed, Toronto in particular. I think the statistic you always hear is there's more cranes in the sky building tall buildings in Toronto than any other city in the blah, 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 and yet...
And transit.
Yeah.
We're building transit.
We are.
Yeah.
New York built a subway, too. It's cheaper to build it. It's expensive in Toronto, but boy, it's expensive to build subways here. But with all that building, right, and the supply economists, the market urbanists say, well, if you just build more, housing becomes affordable. Well, I know the best thing that happened to me to move in Toronto was the investment in my house. That's the best investment I ever made in my life. It's gone up like gangbusters. And so much so, believe this or not, according to this demographia calculation, Toronto now is a less affordable place than New York. I know that sounds shocking to you, but Vancouver is actually even more unaffordable, but Toronto's right up there with London and New York. It's because incomes are somewhat lower, comparatively speaking, but housing prices are so high. You took a series of measures to try to get the housing market not just back under control, but both to create an environment where people could add supply, but so prices wouldn't rise. So why don't you talk about your perspective on the housing market, your perspective on real estate and building, and also your perspective on the need to do stuff for people who are finding housing unaffordable? Yeah,
so we... It really has and had reached a point of real unfairness and inequity. And so I'm not going to suggest that we have completely tackled this and that we understand exactly where it's going to go. But we looked at what levers we could pull to try to cool down the housing market, because it was really, really heating up. And people felt, and a lot of this is about the emotion attached to it, felt that it was out of control, and felt that because of the bidding wars and because of the number of turnovers, that it was getting less and less possible for them to buy a home, and that was a reality, and it continues to be a challenge. But we did a number of things. We looked at where there was speculation and how could we inject a note of calm into that. And we looked at what British Columbia, what Vancouver had done, and so we determined that we'd gotten to a point where having a foreign speculation tax, actually, so a 15% tax on foreign speculation would actually be a deterrent. And we've seen that. We've actually seen those purchases go down, and so that's had a cooling effect. We also said to developers, we want you to build affordable rental stock, because it wasn't just about buying homes that was a challenge, Richard. It was also finding rental that wasn't going to increase at 50%, 100%. And so we did two things around the rental market. We said to developers, we want to see rental stock built, and we are going to put in place a fund that's actually going to help you. If you're going to build rental, we'll look at how we can help you with not huge subsidies, but some easing of that. And we also put rent control. Now, I know this is a very controversial subject, but in Ontario, we had this bizarre situation where there was rent control on buildings that had been built before 1991. When I became a member of the provincial legislature in 2003, I came in on a platform of rent control because just about half of the people I represent live in multi-residential units, and their rent controls their rent was going up very, very quickly. And so we took a number of measures. But what we didn't do was extend rent control to those buildings that had been built after 1991, because the developers said to us, don't do that, because that will mean we won't build rental stock. So we're going to build rental stock, don't extend rent control. Well, I can tell you, between 2003 and 2013, very little rental stock was built. What was built was condominiums, and that became the rental stock. But it was not affordable rental stock. So we just said, you know what? this hasn't worked, folks. We're going to extend rent control beyond those buildings, and that's what we've done. We're going to monitor that. We're going to see, what happens. But there was an element of calling the bluff of the developers because we weren't seeing that behavior. The other thing that we have done is we have introduced permissive legislation for municipalities to put in place in inclusionary zoning, so that developers, you know what inclusionary zoning is, that developers need to build a certain percentage of affordable housing as they build new stock. So, and the other thing we've done is we're working with the development industry and with municipalities to find public land that could be accessed at at a reasonable rate, so that that becomes an affordable start to affordable housing projects.
You also, Toronto is, like New York, known even more so for its NIMBYism. Not in my backyard, don't build it, we want to keep our neighborhood, tidy and everything. You also changed, it's a long thing, but we had this OMB, where the developer could go if they wanted to get around a local restriction. You've also taken that on and kind of changed that. And for this group, I think that's also useful for you to speak.
The bane of my existence.
But it's useful for you just to give them a sense of even the policy and the politics of it.
Yeah, so I actually started my political career in a neighborhood that is, it kind of came to maturation in the 1920s. There's a lot of two-story retail and then apartments above the retail. A lot of, mainly single-family dwellings, but very low-rise, very mixed income. And so I cut my teeth on working with groups in that neighborhood who want it to stay exactly the same forever. Never change. If it's 2 stories, it's going to be 2 stories forever. And so I've always struggled with that balance between how do we have smart, progressive development and change, and how do we have local decision making. And so what had been happening was that decisions that had been made by city councils were being overturned by this provincial body. And the provincial body, the OMB, was following provincial policy because we were trying to intensify, but the responsibility for that was not being taken by the local city council. So the change we've tried to make is to push that decision making back to the local level, to require that local city councils, community councils take responsibility for the necessary intensification, the necessary development at the local level, but that they do that in the way that works for them and works for their communities. It doesn't mean that there can't be development. There has to be development. We're building transit. There's got to be intensification along those transit lines, but it does need to be more local. And so that's the change that we've made with the OMB. I hope it works, Richard, because we have made a number of changes to the OMB, and I'll be honest in this room. It's a very, very challenging problem for any city to make progressive change. It's very, very hard.
No, I agree with you on that, and I think Jane Jacobs would have agreed with you on the grounds of subsidiarity. Many people, economists, would say, well, leave it at the state, leave it at the province, but I think it's important for these localities to grapple with local issues and hopefully make the right decision. Anyway, you said to me you wanted questions,
we do.
And we've talked, but we have about 15 minutes. So really, if you have a question, just the ground rules are a question, not a lecture, and keep it specific and the question that the Premier can address. Please, behind.
With Google deciding that they were going to develop out the lower Don lands and invest there for sidewalk labs, and seeing how progressive Calgary is and Edmonton has been in placemaking and basically transforming those cities. Overnight for them to basically change, downtown Edmonton and the ice hockey district. It's crazy considering what it looked like 10 years ago. Same thing with respect to Calgary, right? And to see how Mayor Nenshi and their approach when it comes to city planning and things like that, creating connectivity and really a strong focus now on trying to deal with mass transit. But I could see why they would look at Toronto and see it as a favorable place where In Canada, you don't have the history that you do in the United States. It's easier to kind of transform communities because of the population movement and because of the amount of immigrants. With that being said, with sidewalk labs, I'm seeing that there's a lot of people coming and there's a lot of resistance and sensors and things like that. The city of the future, it's confusing.
Yep.
People don't want people watching them. There's a lot of fear surrounding that. But at the same time, I also think that the cities like Calgary and Edmonton are very progressive, and so they were able to push that boundary. With that being said, what do you think is going to be like the catalyst to push past the resistance and to make it happen? Because I definitely see a lot of opportunity there.
I think people just have a lot of questions. I just think there aren't answers yet to what it's going to look like. It's early stages. I think people need to know what that community is going to look like, how it's going to be developed, and I think the more concrete it gets, literally, the more people will buy into it. There are probably a majority of people in Toronto who don't even know what the possibilities are, and so I think there's a big public awareness campaign that needs to happen. I think that there are general concerns about technology and connectivity that have to be addressed, not just there, but generally. I don't think we would have all the questions about cybersecurity that we do if we weren't asking those questions. And I think the third piece is that I think people have questions about connectivity to that part of the city, and will there be the money to make the investments, and what's that going to look like? And that's where the province and the city and the national government have to work together to assure those investments. But we're early stages. I think generally there's a lot of excitement about the possibilities.
Well, I have one question here, and then I notice there's 2 microphones. Why don't we ask people next to queue up behind these 2 microphones, if that will make it easier for us than to look at hands. So your question, and then the 2 microphones that will be
I'm
there
Dick
now.
Anderson, past president of the New York Building Congress. You probably know that the recent national tax legislation in this country reduces deductibility of property taxes and mortgage interest. And my understanding is that Canada has never had deductibility for mortgage interest. And there's been much speculation here about what this might mean for the American housing market. What is it the difference meant to home ownership and home purchasing in the housing market in Canada?
Well, you probably are more expert in that than I am, but I can tell you that some of those measures are things that have been suggested to us and to our national government that we should look at. But I can't really tell you. We've never lived with those things, so we haven't had the advantage of those, or people haven't had the advantage of them. So I think that we need to look at all of the mechanisms and see if there are things that we should be doing. I guess my question to you would be, what do you think is going to happen as a result here?
We're not sure, and of course it varies by regions of the country depending on your local and state tax structure.
You've got a lot of foregone
revenue there. But do you have what proportion of residents of Canada own their own home?
It's higher than the U.S. It's higher. It's in the mid-60s. And generally,
except in the urban centers, right? But generally it's all home ownership.
So it sounds to me like there's not been a real negative impact.
The biggest difference in Canada, look, I bought a house there. The biggest difference is the banking regulations have been much better. So you've tended not to get the bubbles. Right. Now the Premier may have been dealing with a little bit under her watch, which she's tried to cool, but you haven't had the bubbles, the speculative bubbles in Canada to the extent. So I think it's more on the banking regulation side. But to be honest, the mortgage interest deduction doesn't seem to have made an effect. No.
Thanks, good morning. As Toronto has sprawled around the lake to the Buffalo border, do you eventually envision a kind of lake-oriented economic area that expands to include Rochester and Buffalo, as well as Toronto, driven by just the intensity of activity in Toronto and the resources that still exist in upstate New York?
We tried that ferry, right?
I remember the ferry.
Remember the ferry?
Yeah, before I moved.
It would have been great. Yes, I think that there's a natural connection because of the lake of all of those communities, and I think that we haven't exploited it. I think that there's much more that we could do together, and I think that's something that needs to be explored. That would be my response. I just don't think we've looked at it closely.
And that's why the NAFTA thing, to go back, is so dumb. Sorry.
Yeah.
That this is a natural economic region.
Exactly.
It is the way to create more growth and development in Buffalo and Rochester. It is the way, we talked about Detroit and Windsor. These partnerships are the way to spur regional development.
Well, and not only that, when I go to China or I go to Japan, I go to other parts of the world to sell Ontario, one of the selling points is we're one of the doors to the Great Lakes region,
Yep.
right? That is, people don't think so much about Toronto. They think about the whole region. And so I think that that's another argument for our connectivity. And I'll make an environmental argument. We're working with Michigan and the Great Lakes governors on invasive species. There's a lot of work that we have to do together to make sure that we steward that resource.
That's a great success, by the way.
Yeah.
Could you speak to what you perceive as the roles and responsibilities of universities like NYU or U of T in city building and not just in sort of developing educated workforces, but as major property owners in mature real estate markets that present a lot of opportunities and challenges, their responsibilities from kind of real estate and land use decision making perspective?
Well, I think the responsibility is that there be a partnership and an acknowledgement that there is a relationship between what the decisions that are made by the university, by the institution, and the city, and that there be the creation of a forum or fora where those conversations can take place, and there can actually be an intentional path forward. And I think Merritt Gertler at U of T is a planner. He understands the importance of the university in the city and the city around the university. So I think there's a huge responsibility. I think the presence of the university is really important. We've got places like Brampton that are just waiting to get a university in their downtown core because they know that brings a vitality that they want to see. So we shouldn't abandon that when the institution is huge. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge for sure when the institution is as big as this one or the U of T.
I think your question was terrific. I want to make a plug for the lab. This is something Stephen and I are taking very seriously, the idea of anchors and inclusion, and we hope to be focusing more on the role of universities. Universities have played such an important role in the public-private partnerships that rebuilt our cities. But we do know, I'm not blaming the university, as much as they play a role in innovation, the areas of universities do have higher levels of inequality and economic segregation. It's new research we're doing at the Martin Prosperity Institute. And ways to begin to steer universities to the kinds of interest and outcome you make is going to be a big, big project of the Urban Lab and in our joint work together with NYU and the University of Toronto and the Martin Prosperity Institute. So keep pushing, but it's a very, very important issue that we're going to be grappling with.
Good morning. So you've mentioned connectivity a few times during this discussion, and you also spoke about infrastructure investments in the province, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about infrastructure investments along the lines of the power grid in the province.
Mm-hmm.
So specifically the expansion of the generation, like what angle are you? Our investments in?
Investments to protect or to make it more resilient, or I think even cybersecurity was mentioned briefly before. So just any projects, major projects or initiatives that you might be considering.
Yeah, so we've made huge investments in our grid over the last decade. We shut down our coal plants, and so we got into we jump-started a renewables industry in Ontario, but more than that, we rebuilt a grid that had been neglected for years, and that, it was government after government had not made the investments. So we've made about a $50 billion investment in power lines and infrastructure around the province. I would say the big projects that we're working on right now are how do we get broadband? How do we, how do we build that infrastructure out across the province, particularly in rural and northern areas? But there are within our urban centers, our urban regions, some pockets where that connectivity doesn't exist. How do we get to the northern communities? Because we've got northern communities that are powered through diesel at this point, and so we're actually partnering with First Nations, or private companies are partnering with First Nations, and the government is playing a role in getting those power lines and that generating capacity in place. So I would say that we're trying to make sure that our grid is resilient, that it is reliable, and that we reach those communities that haven't been reached before. There's a real, I'll give you the political read on this. It's really expensive. I just threw around that number, $50 billion. And those of you who know what's going on in Ontario, electricity prices have been a huge political football and something that we've had to manage. But it would have been irresponsible for us not to step up and do this work, and so we will weather that political storm because it means that we now have a reliable, clean. Our electricity grid is about 90-some%, 95% clean at this point, GHG pollution-free.
You have the last question.
Going back to trade just for a moment,
Yeah.
I'd like to get your advice.
Uh-oh.
As a New Yorker who understands the visceral appeal of Buy American, and obviously it's a bipartisan vote here in
Yeah.
the legislature. I also think that's very unfortunate. The advice would be, in your meetings, what do you find is a way to get through?
Yep.
Because sometimes the responses to that are very economically technical,
Yeah.
and to show the benefits of the cross-border jobs, but you're trying to combat something that is a very visceral appeal.
Yeah. So I think businesses that are going to suffer and are going to lose jobs need to be talking to the politicians and saying, if you do this, we cannot bid on this contract, and we will not be able to produce this wealth for your state. I think it's as basic as that. I think that Walmart and Ford and Chrysler and all of the companies that are worried about NAFTA have to go to their legislators and they have to say, if you do this, you're going to lose this number of jobs in Oregon, you're going to lose this number of jobs in Kentucky, and that is what politicians need to hear, and I believe will react to, and I think that is starting to happen. I'm not sure here in New York, because we did a full court press a number of months ago. The Buy America provision that was going forward was much broader, and we made those arguments in Albany, and we got that pushed back, but still a narrower version went forward. But I think the arguments that are most compelling are about that very local job gain or job loss.
So I want to thank the Premier for spending time with us. And I just want to put a little context around this. We are in a time now that's analogous to the last great industrial revolution, the rise of the Gilded Age and the robber barons. When the Rockefellers and the Morgans and GM and Ford and US Steel were building a new economy and building their fortunes. And like that time, we see surging inequality, surging geographic inequality, people threatened with displacement. And what happens? You read your history books. We had a populist moment. We had a populist movement in the United States to roll the clock backward. But what came after that? A progressive moment. And I was just on the phone with these journalists in San Francisco yesterday, talking about literally the pitched battle going there. The question you made about sidewalk labs, here's a great investment that people are terrified and the pitchforks are coming out. Why it was so great to have you here is, in your own way, quietly and humbly as you are building that progressive agenda. You are one of the few politicians, political leaders in this world who is saying, look, we don't want to destroy capitalism. We're not here to take it down. We're here to make it work equitably and inclusively, and that ball has to get rolling here in this country. And not just by projecting hopes and dreams up to the next presidential candidate, by doing locally and doing it state by state, creating an agenda, a truly progressive agenda, which means dealing with universal basic income, dealing with minimum wage, dealing with the froth in the housing market, investment in people in transit. And why it's so great to have you here is because you're doing it. You're one of the people on the ground doing it in reality. So thank you, and I'd like to invite my great colleague who runs the Urban Lab, Stephen Pedigo, to provide some closing remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Just really quickly, in addition to sort of thanking Premier Wynne and Richard for their time today, I'd also like to thank the Premier's office. Your team was wonderful in helping us arrange this, as well as our colleagues at the University of Toronto, the Martin Prosperity Institute. Thank you for your collaboration as well. If you are thinking about the next SHAC event, we have one upcoming. March 20th is our REIT conference, Opportunities in the Age of Disruption. It will be at the Pierre Hotel. And the luncheon presentation is from Chairman of the Equity Group, Sam Zell. So it should be a wonderful event. So we hope that you can join us. You can find more information at our website, at SHAC's website. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. And we look forward to your comments and feedback about today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks.